this is a great venue for this. And certainly, if you've been to Cyber Guild events in the past, there are a lot bigger audiences. These more intimate conversations, they actually tend to have better questions, so no pressure. But I want to make sure we leave some time to ask those questions. And since we're the first duo up today, I thought we would sort of set the stage for some additional conversations that I know are going to come up later on in the day. And so I'm really happy to be up here with Shawn because if anyone knows what's happening that we need to be planning for, and again, C-suite sort of perspective, what you should be planning for, it's going to be Shawn and CrowdStrike. They get to see it as it's happening, and certainly, and I'm assuming AI is going to come up in a number of conversations later, the pace just continues to pick up. So let's just sort of get those questions out of the way and start with, as companies are looking into 2024 and making future investments, what do you see as the landscape for threats that are headed our way? We all know, insider threat. We all know, your normal, let's call it the normal network defense capabilities that everyone is protecting themselves against. But as you look out into the future, where do you see the future of network defense and cyber defense going?
Great question. So first, thanks to Cyber Guild and Teresa for the kind introduction. When I think about who the adversaries are, first of all, we talk about, you mentioned insider, major organized crime groups, nation states, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. We're seeing increased sophistication from these groups. They're only getting better. They're only getting stronger. The target space is getting bigger. Every day, new technology is introduced into corporate environments, and every time a device is introduced or new applications, it makes the target space that much larger, much more difficult to control, protect, identify, recognize as network defenders. And the adversaries that are creating new exploits and targeting new technology that has been oftentimes rushed to market or introduced without a thorough evaluation of the security protocols, because companies are focused on generating revenue, getting products into the market that they want to sell, and they're not always thinking about the security aspects. The adversaries, though, are watching what's being introduced because they're always looking for that access in. When I think about what's coming, a lot of it is in place right now. The adversaries that are using existing capabilities of the operating system. So they're not downloading tools from their command and control servers as they have for many years, but they're gaining access through breaching identities. And once they have made access into the environment, being able to exploit the capabilities of the operating system. So much more difficult to detect once they assume a valid identity in the environment. When you've got a valid user who's got access and that it's credentialed access, almost impossible to identify. So that's a challenge. You mentioned AI. I'll just touch on it quickly and we can go a little deeper. But AI has been used in cybersecurity. We've been using AI for a dozen years at CrowdStrike to identify anomalous behavior within large swaths of data. I think when we talk about AI now, the common nomenclature, it's referring to generative AI, which is a user interface that allows the common person with little or no technical capabilities to access this very powerful data. From a threat perspective, I think we're seeing a lot more. So I talk about the target space getting bigger, but the pool of adversaries is getting bigger because in addition to all the very capable nation states and organized crime groups, you've got the layperson who now has a very powerful tool at their disposal, helps them write phishing emails, helps them write specific exploits to target specifically identified vulnerabilities. So a common person is now getting into the space and posing a risk to nations, to companies.
So it's depressing, right? Well, I want to get into a question, and this goes a lot towards sort of what I'm looking at when I'm looking at companies on behalf of the venture or private equity. And I know this is a problem everyone faces. Small business, mid-tier, large system integrators needing better and better tools, to your point, is more important. But when you're small, you can't always necessarily afford them. But you're probably not as big of a target as a larger system integrator might be either. But where do you find is this sweet spot between trying to roll your own? When you're talking to the executives who need to be making these investments, when is sort of that time period, whether by size, number of users, or revenue, that one should start to be looking to outsource this or start to work with partners like CrowdStrike, for example, because it is a problem I think everyone faces, and it's like, well, when do we double down on these investments, and when do we bring in help rather than trying to do this ourselves?
So I think whenever you're looking at security writ large, it starts by looking at what's the risk that you face. I think the risk in this area is so significant, and outsourcing it makes sense. When you've got the expertise and people who understand who the threat actors are, they understand what their tactics and techniques are, they understand how to identify it, they understand how to use the tools. It's similar to most anything that you do, right? If you're looking for somebody, you've got a financial services firm and you're looking for some unusual legal capability, doing business in another country, for example. You don't hire an attorney that specifically focuses on that country. Typically, you outsource it to a outside counsel, third party, and you can go down the line where there's outsourcing. So, I think focus on your core business and let people handle these issues that are of the highest, most significant risk. The reality is, for a lot of companies, they may not see an attack but a couple times a year, and their folks oftentimes are not well versed enough to understand and recognize what those risks are. So I think it's not a advertisement for my company. I just think at a high level, it makes sense to focus on expertise in an area where the risk is so high you don't want to make a mistake.
So I remember needing to make these decisions, and when you're working in the national security of any portion of the public sector as well, it becomes a little bit dicey. And I want to get to Teresa's point on the SEC rulings on incident reporting and everything else. And, I just remember 5 years ago, 10 years ago, people not wanting to have to disclose, right? Affects price per share, affects, customer confidence. There's a lot of reasons why one would not want to sort of admit when you'd been owned in any way. But if people do not sort of come together and talk about trends that are happening with, adversarial attacks, it becomes a problem. So now, as you see the SEC rulings changing on, who's reporting and what to report around incidents, do you think this is going to be helpful, or do you think it's going to be more of the same?
I think it is helpful. And then, it's not, as you describe it, the SEC didn't put that in place so that people will share information, right? They put it in to protect investors because companies were very reluctant, understandably, to talk about this issue. But if you haven't read an 8K recently, they're a lot of fun. They're interesting. The issue, I think, comes down to materiality, right? And understanding what the impact is in the environment, and how does that impact the corporation's ability to continue as an entity. How does it brings some transparency to the process. It's not a perfect system, and then I think there will be new iterations as we go forward to fine-tune it. But I think at a high level, it makes sense for companies to report when they have a material, and that's a key word, material incident in their environment for their investors and their shareholders. And the fact is, there are a lot of companies that have suffered significantly. I mean, read the 8K from Microsoft most recently, that the Russian the Russians are in their environment and they don't know what they've taken, they can't do a damage assessment, and they don't know how to get them out. That's pretty significant when that is the ubiquitous operating system for the globe. And, that's what their report says. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but.
And therein also lies opportunity. At least it's kept me in business for 20 years, is the fact that the adversaries continue. And sadly, some of them are the same, throughout the last 25 years. So let's talk a little bit then about where you see those threats coming from. And this is mildly off topic, but I am very curious because it will relate back to a lot of what we're doing. Election fraud and what's going to be coming up on the horizon this year. I mean, and not just in the United States. Globally, the number of elections that are happening this year could be a big impact on, what we see in trends in adversarial techniques. So did you want to, I'm certain you have an opinion on election fraud.
I do have an opinion. Let me, excuse me, before I do that, and I will, just on the SEC rules, because I think it's important. One of the other pieces of that is getting the CEO, the CISO, key executives involved in understanding what the security issue is. So it's not just reporting of incidents, but it's also reporting in the 10K annually on what your cybersecurity plan is, what your risks are, et cetera. Getting senior executives accountable for this changes the dynamic quite a bit in terms of their willingness and interest in resourcing the cybersecurity program and team, their visibility into how do they accept risk, do they push out new technologies without ensuring that there's adequate security because they've got to sign a document that goes to the SEC. So that's an important part as well. In terms of the election, there's two pieces to this. I think there's the electoral infrastructure, election infrastructure that could be targeted and has been targeted. So, different committees, candidates, voter registration rolls, committees or organizations that are tallying votes, counties, electoral offices, public sector. There's a whole kind of ecosystem that could be targeted virtually and physically, honestly, but virtually, and the concern that votes get changed, et cetera. And I think that there's validity to that. And we've seen, and we've been protecting different electoral parts of this ecosystem for many years. And we've seen attempted exploitation. But I think what we're seeing now, and if we're looking at what's happening not just here but globally, it is the misinformation piece where for a pretty limited investment, adversaries are seeing a huge ROI. And, through the use of distributing false information, when I think about certain governments, right, and we've seen Russia, China, and Iran specifically engage in this type of activity going back to 2016. Quite honestly, I first saw it in 2008 when I was in the assistant director of the cyber division, and China targeted both then Senator Obama's campaign and Senator McCain's campaign simultaneously. It was a pure espionage play. They were looking at both candidates to see whichever became president, what their foreign policy was going to be, what was their economic policy, their military strategy. That's what they were looking for. And that's espionage is accepted globally, right? It's an acceptable nation state event. What we're seeing now, though, and what we saw in 2016 with Russia was an attempt to operationalize not just collecting intelligence from an espionage perspective to better inform policymakers in China, but now to actually change the the populace, the perception of the populace. We've seen nation states specifically targeting particular incendiary issues like Second Amendment, pro-life, abortion rights, and putting out information to both sides and focusing on the particular issue, the opposite side of each issue, to get people to engage in a discourse that is less than civil. It's all about creating this divisiveness inside the United States. It's happening elsewhere as well. It happened in the UK. It happened recently in Taiwan with the elections there. And we expect it to continue to happen. It's a democracy that's being targeted. And it's not just here in the United States. It's democracy. It's to create any chink in the armor in the United States or any other democracy. India, South Africa is being targeted with upcoming elections. We've seen it throughout Western Europe. It's of value to these nation states who seek to displace the United States as a global leader.
It is funny too because it's not coming in at they're not targeting they are, but the CEO of this company, let's just go after this person. They are, to your point, these information factories with you could be a cat lover or you like to travel or it's wine, and they're getting it to you through, user groups of, your hobbies, and then serving up. It's just like targeted advertising. There is targeted, espionage. And it's unfortunate as social media just continues to sort of...
social media is the most prevalent platform being exploited, where you've got thousands or tens of thousands of anonymous, fraudulent identities that have been created specifically to push misinformation. And when you look at some of these personas that have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers and are putting out information that is factually inaccurate, specifically to create and foment divisiveness inside the United States.
Vitriol. And it's the same guy with a Trump ad as a Biden ad or a pro-U.S., anti-U.S. And they're just promulgating false information.
I'm a believer that national security is not a partisan issue. Doesn't matter what side of the aisle you come from. If it's national security and the electoral process, the free electoral process is being targeted, I think people actually need to come together in a way that addresses that from what's good for the country as opposed to what's good for my particular party, whatever that may be.
Yeah, it is a shame that we couldn't use the same vehicles to, promote this a lot more than we see the trolls spewing nonsense. But unfortunately, we all have to worry about that too within our companies. And, it's a fine line between where you allow free speech and where you say this is a work environment, and you need to follow our policies. I know it's a constant struggle. Certainly I saw that. I'm sure a number of your clients are also seeing things like that. I would like to maybe at this point, just to stay on target, throw it out to you all to see if you have a question on anything we've sort of discussed so far, or anything you're seeing that you'd like us to hit on. Certainly now would be the time. Debbie's already standing in the back with the microphone, so that's how I know it's time to ask questions.
Hi there. Good morning. David B. About. This is really around the topic of generative AI. Many of our discussions have been about the use of it for attack or defend. We're also seeing a pretty significant increase in interest of integrating a generative AI model within business operations. And so I'm curious about your perspectives on how is the role of a CISO, a CSO evolving to be a part of the defense of that model that's going to become integrated into operations. And it can be governance, it can be sort of any aspect.
It's a great question, and you're absolutely right. When you talk about governance, I think that A lot of companies, look, like any technology, right? Companies want to embrace it. They want to utilize it. They want to drive revenue. But this is part of that expansion of the ecosystem in the target space. You've got to do it with the foresight that it is going to be attacked. It's going to be exploited. Adversaries are going to look to gain access. You also have to look at it from a privacy perspective. What is being fed in to that LLM that is company proprietary? You're putting customer PII in. You're putting sensitive intellectual property into an LLM that's going out to the public, into the cloud, into the public. So the governance piece is huge. And, in my organization, it's one of the first things we did with our CISO is to focus on, let's build a framework. Let's make sure we know who's accessing the LLMs, which LLMs, do they have a business need for it? And people should be encouraged to use the technology where it's adding value to the business, but do so with the understanding that it is something that could be potentially dangerous. It could have a negative impact on the organization. It could open us up to liability. So let's build a framework. And the governance piece is right on. We've got a privacy attorney. We've got general counsel, CISO, focused on developing the protocols so that it's done in a safe manner. Just like you should have for every new piece of technology. But I think AI is one of those that companies have raced to embrace without giving it the appropriate attention. And it's sessions like this that I've spoken at where I can see people kind of looking at their partner saying, I didn't think about that. We're using this in our marketing campaign. We're using it for communications. We're using it to help the legal team, whatever it may be. And they haven't thought about where that data is going and how it's being ingested. So it's a really great question.
The flip side of that, too, is, frankly, no one pays enough attention to that when you're looking for an exit at some point. Managing risk and diligence has always been a key part of the process. But where that CISO or CIO and the CSO sit in the hierarchy of priority of the management team who's giving these management briefings, you can tell a lot by where and how much they value that contribution. And frankly, it is something that we examine pretty heavily now. Like, are they doing the reporting they're supposed to be doing? Are they putting measures in place to sort of keep up and try and stay ahead of, the persistent threat and the, new environments you find yourself in? And I think it's going to be even more of an issue. We've always worried about managing for indemnification and, are you being sued? What about those future threats that you don't even know are happening yet? And it's always the poor CISO who just gets beat up about this, right? Because if it's working, nobody gives a shit about that guy. But if it doesn't, or girl, but if it's not, they're on everybody's mind. And so they're either yelling at you or they're installing some new process that's going to make your job harder. And therefore, they're an irritant. Well, if they're an irritant to the C-suite, there's a problem because they are basically saving the C-suite and the company from the most imminent threat that the company could have in any given day. So I think you're going to see an even bigger importance put on what is the process by which you're doing your reporting and how are you handling and staying ahead of everything when you're looking to exit as well, as a different perspective. So.
Good morning, Shawn. Thank you for being here. Always good to see you. Philip Niedermeyer. I have the privilege of being on the Solarium Commission since 2019 and currently chair the Technology Advancement Center, which sits outside of the NSA and Cyber Command. We're in a unique time in our industry in the sense that we're having new leadership come in at the NSA. Leadership within the NSA is changing that we're very close to. Rob Joyce is retiring next week. And Harry Coker has just taken command at the ONCD. Great. If that group were here in the audience today, you have such a unique perspective because you sit dead in the sights of our enemies. You're defending millions of America's most precious resources, the large and middle market companies and the federal government. What message would you want to give to that group if they were here this morning?
To the government group?
Yeah, to the government group who's come in now new. I mean, it's we have a lot of changes.
I think,
Hawk, etc.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make sure I was clear on who you were suggesting the audience was. I think from my perspective, I've been speaking about this actually for a long, long time. We're not yet at the point, although with Gen AI, we may get here pretty quickly, where computers are targeting computers without the use of human beings. But today, there's still a human being at the end of every one of these attacks sitting behind a keyboard. And while we can defend the networks, and the private sector in this country is responsible for protecting the networks, because the U.S. government, NSA, does not have technology sitting in the ISPs around the globe or around the country that are blocking the malicious ones and zeros. So the private sector is responsible for protecting their network, and they do that as well as they can right now. But where we need more assistance is in targeting the actual human beings that are launching the attacks, because the attacks will go on indefinitely. You can block, and the adversaries are just going to continue to move and pivot until they get in and achieve their objective. Because unless they're physically taken off the field through a law enforcement action or some other effort, they're going to continue to do what they do. And I think that this is a unique role for the U.S. government, and that there needs to be more forward defense, as NSA has used. And I understand it's a complex issue, but there needs to be more done. And now I'm not suggesting that it has to be done electronically. There's financial sanctions, there are diplomatic actions, but there's more that needs to be done nation to nation to create a better framework, to be honest. What's appropriate, what's not, what are the red lines? If you cross this red line, what's going to happen to you? And use a stick. Carrots don't work in this space, it seems. And there needs to be more done. And that is a function that this private sector, that they don't have the authorities, they don't have the capabilities in many cases to do. I don't think they want to do that. I don't think that's their role. But it has to be done by the government. And that is what I would say. And it's got to be done in a collaborative way. Taking the capabilities, CIA, FBI, NSA, DOD, putting them all together, using the authorities of all those organizations in a coordinated fashion. There has been a lot of success, but when you look at it in the totality of what the risk is and what the total breadth of targeting is, it's about that big. It's got to be done.
That's why we'll always be behind as well. That's Title 10, Title 50. I mean,
you got to use the whole,
until you
all the tools in your arsenal.
Yeah.
Title 18, Title 10, Title 50.
So Tiffanny, Shawn, this really question is for you. I want to shift gears a little bit. So when you ran Novetta as the president and CEO, you managed to double not just the sales, but also the number of people that you were able to bring into this business of intelligence, cyber, and defense at a very difficult time, because I believe a pandemic happened in there for, a few years. And so I'd be interested, and you were commenting earlier about the CISO and how you held your CISO accountable. Was the CISO reporting directly to you? And what are your top 3, takeaways, recommendations for us?
Well, one thought on during the time period in which I was at Novetta, the COVID actually, I think, helped, believe it or not, with this remote work and securing remote work, or at least working towards putting those steps in place. And it helped at the agencies where we needed to see more, more openness to working from home and sort of outsourcing some of what was always, and we can just use the fort because we're both familiar with it. I loved seeing them run these beta projects to, outsource a lot of that so that it didn't have to be done on site. If anything, that has helped the U.S. government, whether it's the FBI, NRO, NSA, CIA, Cyber Command. They all started to realize, first, we need to set up better infrastructure to make that possible and happen. And that certainly allowed us to distribute our workforce a lot more, because without the ability to hire employees that must be within 40 miles of, the work site and have to work on site in a lot of those agencies where these problems are encountered every day. It just was untenable. There's only so many people in the DMV, right, that you can bring in. But that COVID and the pandemic certainly allowed us to expand both our workforce and the customers' openness to continuing to allow that kind of work environment to continue. So I would say, as a positive outcome of a really terrible time, we certainly were able to grow and continue to support those efforts. So, yeah, it was certainly worthwhile to see the agencies start to open up their hands, but it also opens up the aperture for adversaries, and so it's a vicious circle, right? Cycle.
We have time for one more question before we do the takeaways from Tiffanny and Shawn, and then we'll move to a panel. Any other burning questions?
The CISOs. When I do CrowdStrike, at least in the past, I think of you guys as a BDR companies a lot more now. CISOs have lots of tools to buy, and I think what's been really compelling in the market over the last few years is platform companies building out platforms lock you into a single lock you into a single vendor's ecosystem, whether it's Microsoft or Palo or CrowdStrike. How would you guys see that your product strategy going forward? Do you intend to make that whole platform? Do you believe that the right strategy is to work for your products to work seamlessly with other companies' products? And again, I'm thinking about your strategy, but maybe from the context that CISO has to apply and implement and use all those stuff. So
I think we built a platform from the first day that I got there. That was the plan. There was no technology when I got there. There was a vision, and the vision was one single sensor platform. I don't want to make this a CrowdStrike commercial, but I think when you're asking about a CISO, I've sat down with many CISOs. I've talked to many boards. I've talked to many C-suites where they buy technology, one of these, two of these, and they sit on the shelf, and they're not being implemented. And I think that what the platform does is it simplifies things for people. One of the things we've seen where adversaries are exploiting technology, it's the seams in two different technologies from two different places that aren't really covering. And I think that the platform allows you to get a more holistic coverage. It's easier from a procurement perspective. It's easier from a legal perspective. It's easier in a lot of different ways. So I just think if we want to make things easier for CISOs and the security team, I think that allows them to focus more intently on the business at hand, stopping the breach. And anything you can do to simplify that, I think, makes it better, more effective, certainly more effective, and absolutely more efficient from both a response capability and from a financial perspective.
It's not just those companies coming together as a platform either, especially for those of you who work with government. A lot of the regulations now, if you're the prime, you become the CISO of all the subs that work for you as well, which is really, it's not just insider threat. It's every subcontractor you bring in and work with, because you are the conduit to the customer. And so when they don't have really strong security posture, you are just as liable for the work they do on the program you run. And that can actually be a lot harder than just integrating those different companies in an acquisition. I see people nodding. Yeah, it's a problem. But okay.